Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. On behalf of all of us, it's truly my pleasure to welcome and thank you for joining this conversation. Today's webinar is the third in a series that is focused on LGBTQ issues in the Middle East, North Africa region. This series is intended to commemorate Pride Month, which my colleagues and I at Columbia here in New York happily extended by an additional 7 days. We have convened a distinguished panel of authors to discuss representations of sexuality, specifically queer sexuality in contemporary Arab fiction and nonfiction. Sadly, one of the authors who resides in Jordan had no choice but to pull out of today's discussion. Queer people who all too frequently feel marginalized, isolated, fearful, and despised take refuge, like few other groups, in film and music and books. It is here that we are able to find our people, our tribe. In the hands of a capable, sensitive artist, queer individuals are provided with the rare opportunity to encounter a sympathetic likeness of ourselves, free of prejudice or stereotype. On page 1 of the novel, up on the big screen, or celebrated in songs like Shimm El Yasmin by the Lebanese indie rock band Mashrou Layla. When one thinks about LGBTQ+ activism and the ongoing global struggle to secure rights, progress tends to proceed along two parallel tracks: the political legal track and the arts social track. When we think about landmark events in the struggle, it seems to me that the political legal stories, perhaps understandably, capture a disproportionate share of our attention. The mind's eye hones in on news footage of police or state security forces brutalizing queer activists. Or we open the newspaper and see a photo of jubilant people cheering outside legislatures or courthouses when laws prohibiting same-sex conduct are repealed, or laws permitting same-sex marriage are enacted. But the second track on which progress moves forward, in cinema, in music, in literature, is equally vital. For it is in the arts, I contend, that a subtle form of soft power asserts itself, especially over time. Books and films validate the experience and the existence of queer people. They present the other, the queer person, the Arab, the gay Arab, as accessible, understandable, and humanized. It is a soft power that can condition the broader cultural environment for tolerance and acceptance, and often paves the way for the legal political progress that follows. It is certainly my hope that the books we shall discuss today accomplish just that. As I consider the impact the arts are having and can have on shaping perceptions of queer people in the Arab world in the future, and on securing human rights, I reflect on the impact the arts have had in the past, in my past specifically. As a young man studying and living in America in the 1980s, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, I witnessed firsthand the delicate interplay of two tracks, the political legal and the arts social. On the political legal rail, advocates pressed the Reagan administration's FDA and National Institutes of Health, no friend of the suffering, to take action. The activist group ACT UP, clad in their silence equal death t-shirts, forced dramatic confrontations in the streets. Events like these dominated the news headlines for a decade. But on the arts social rail, an equally vital campaign was undertaken to change hearts and minds. Playwright Tony Kushner wrote Angels in America. Armistead Maupin published Tales of the City. Tom Hanks, America's favorite leading man perhaps, starred in Philadelphia, one of the first mainstream Hollywood films to acknowledge HIV/AIDS homosexuality, and homophobia. The theme song for that movie, whose lyrics also dealt with the same topic, became a top 10 hit for Bruce Springsteen. In America, finally, attitudes began to shift. The arts, I contend, are a sly, subtle form of persuasion. And in the hands of a skilled artist, the messages imparted can be devastatingly effective, which makes sense, because if an artist can make the audience laugh, cry, sympathize with, or root for a queer character, that audience member might just get careless and forget about their innate biases and misgivings, and keep reading or watching or listening and have their perspectives changed. Which is why I'm so pleased to see that in the Arab world, literature tackling queer topics and representations of sexualities is on the rise. The authors we have convened today would reflect on their works and explain how their work is advancing the discourse on LGBTQ plus rights within the societies in which they reside. The discussion will also investigate how the authors attempt to reconcile queerness and Arabness in their writings and explore the ways in which Arab LGBTQ plus individuals with multiple identities develop a sense of belonging, whether at home or in the diaspora. You will be introduced to real and fictitious characters of Arab descent who battle discrimination as they find themselves resisting oppression, whether it is heterosexism in their countries or marginalization in their adopted countries. They are differentiated not only because of their sexuality, but also due to their ethnicity, which prevents them from fully integrating into their adopted countries. Their quest to fulfill their desire for belonging in their communities is also hampered by social and legal challenges. As they struggle with invisibility and negative representations, they continue to fight for space within these same dominant narratives that marginalize and decontextualize them. Which finally brings me to introductions. Our discussion will be moderated by Samar Habib, a writer, researcher, and scholar. She is adjunct professor at Mills College, California, teaching a course on intersections in Islamic feminism and queer theory. Samar has published numerous books, articles, and encyclopedia entries on sexualities and queer studies, tracing the emergence of LGBTIQA+ emancipation theology in Islam. Her seminal publications on same-sex love and desire among women in the Middle East and North Africa include Female Homosexuality in the Middle East, Arabo-Islamic Texts on Female Homosexuality, and the two-volume edited collection, Islam and Homosexuality. Samar is also the executive producer of the film Dress Up. Our panel includes Saleem Haddad. Born in Kuwait City to a Lebanese-Palestinian father and an Iraqi-German mother, he was subsequently raised and educated in Jordan, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Saleem's 2016 novel, Guapa, tells the story of Raza, a young gay man coming of age in the Middle East. Set over the course of 24 hours, he lives in an unnamed Arab country, encounters a dazzling array of characters, all of whom lead him closer to confronting his own identity. Zaina Arafat is an LGBTQ Arab Muslim American fiction and nonfiction writer based here in New York, and I'm delighted to report a graduate of Columbia University, where she earned a master's in international affairs in addition to her MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Zaina is the author of the novel You Exist Too Much. I love that, which was published in 2020. A reviewer for O, the Oprah magazine, described the book as a provocative and seductive debut of desire and doubleness that follows the life of a young Palestinian American woman caught between cultural, religious, and sexual identities as she endeavors to lead an authentic life. I am indeed sorry that Madian Al Jazeera, whose memoir, Are You This or Are You This, was just published, is unable to join us. As you listen to our panelists today, some recurrent themes will likely emerge. How notions of LGBTQ plus identity and feelings of belonging are forged in the Middle East. The representation of Arab sexuality in the social and political discourses. The extent to which LGBTQ plus stories narrated by Arab authors are helping advance human rights in the Arab world, one hopes. And perhaps most profoundly, the shared sense of alienation, exile, and solidarity that affects so many queer Arabs. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished moderator and authors, and I am delighted that all of you have joined us. So let's get started. Samar, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Safwan. I'm very grateful to be here with everyone. Thank you to the Columbia Global Centers for organizing this panel. It's an honor. I will keep my words limited, just a couple of minutes, just to reflect on what Safwan said. In reading the three works by Midian, who couldn't join us, Zaina and Saleem, I did actually notice quite a few patterns. And I think the pattern that I kind of want to just sort of call out, given that, we haven't really covered it yet, is that we have two audiences here. We have an audience where, we're trying to push the Overton window on queer Arab identity, but we're also trying to push the Overton window on what it is to be Arab or Muslim or Palestinian in the West. And what really stood out for me was actually the sophistication with which these three works actually broke the stereotype of what it is to be queer, what it is to be Muslim, what it is to be Palestinian, what it is to be Arab in the 21st century, 20 years on from September 11. So social change, I believe, happens when the truth starts to come out. And like Safwan said, what literature does, what cinema does, is it vectors towards justice. It vectors towards the truth. And in this particular case, the truth is that gender and sexual minorities are not monsters. They're not bad people. But specifically with Midian's work and Zaina's work, neither are the Palestinians. They are a complex, heterogeneous population of people that are, at various levels of social impact. And that's what stood out to me, is that there is this level of, there's this teacherliness about these works, that what they're trying to do is really guide us, give us an education about the truth that's trickling out. So that for at least the last 20 years, whether it's queers in the Arab world or whether it's Muslims in the West or Palestinians more broadly, we have had to deal with being misrecognized in public discourse. And what these works of fictions do is deepen the audience's understanding of the complexity of what it is to be human, and they explode the stereotypes. So a very common stereotype that we live with in the West is, let's call it a very low fidelity picture of what it is to be Muslim or what it is to be Palestinian. And what these novels do, the depth with which they dive into their characters, is they deepen the fidelity of that image, and introduce a sophistication that is otherwise unseen. I think Midian's memoir, if anybody gets a chance to read it, does that really well. And when I spoke to him, he said that his goal was to simplify the language as much as possible in order to make it as accessible to as many people as possible. And he talks about, the Islam of his childhood, and it is unrecognizable to the Islam that we see in Western discourse at this time. So I wanted to bring that up because I think it is a critical issue. And before I moderate this wonderful conversation with two amazing writers that I had the privilege of reading their works, I also want to just pass it over to Zaina and Saleem, maybe give them 2 minutes to introduce themselves, give us a brief overview of their work, if that's possible.
Sure. Sure, I'll go first. Hi, it's so lovely to be here, and I've just really enjoyed hearing these introductory remarks. They're really thought-provoking already. So first of all, I close my eyes when I think and speak, so don't be alarmed. I am a Palestinian American writer, a queer Palestinian American writer, and my novel is about a Palestinian American woman who is essentially tracing a pattern of romantic relationships, and often asymmetrical romantic relationships, meaning unrequited love, against the backdrop of her Palestinian heritage and her sort of Muslim identity as well, also while kind of coming to terms with her relationship to her mother. And so the book sort of explores themes of cultural in-betweenness and belonging, and also asks a sort of question of how one's personal history, as well as one's collective cultural history and collective cultural traumas, bear on one's present day self.
Beautiful. Saleem?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, and it's really lovely to be with all three of you. And I'm really sorry that Nadian was unable to join. So I mean, I wrote Guapa. I started writing Guapa actually nearly 10 years ago. I remember it was September 2011, sorry, and the Arab revolutions were sort of still in this very optimistic phase. And I remember I was in Morocco for the 10th anniversary of September 11th, when the idea came to me to draw for the story of like this romance between two Arab men that would sort of start around 2001, at around 9/11, and then sort of end in this like beautiful ending with these two men walking off into the sunset as the Arab revolutions happened. That was how Rasa and Timur were born, but sadly that wasn't really how they ended up. And I think that's partly because as I began to write and as the Arab world sort of started collapsing around me, the novel became this much darker and murkier space for me to try and untangle all of my different allegiances and let's say disassociations with belonging, both how I felt towards the revolutions that were taking place and my sense of confusion and ambivalence about all of the different perspectives that we were suddenly hearing from, but also about my own sexuality and how I could navigate in this new uncertain world and where I fit into it. So Guapa was like this well that I sort of just put all of these different issues that were battling themselves out on the page. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say as an introduction to the novel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, so I think I want to kind of start with diving deeply into how the three works shatter, well, the two works, maybe I can mention what I saw in Midian's work, but how they shatter stereotypes. So these are not the Arabs, Muslims, queers that audiences in the West kind of expect to see or necessarily crave to see. And so, for example, I felt like there was a reversal, really. Zaina's character, who's nameless, I don't know if she has a name, you know, she's hypersexual, and usually depiction of, you know, queer Arab women are quite devoid of sexuality. But there is so much sexuality in this film that it's almost, the sexual activity is almost like a body of evidence. It's almost like a protagonist in and of itself, right? And that kind of does break away from the stereotype of you know, of queer Arab women. By the same token, I found that Guapa was actually, and also Midian's work, is that they're actually not very much focused on, you know, the sex act, but they're actually more invested kind of in emotionality. And there is actually a quote in Guapa where Raza laments that, you know, is there anything more pathetic than a homosexual who's emotional about his homosexuality? So these are kind of like really shattering stereotypes in two very broadly different directions. And I want to start by asking Zaina how you felt about doing that, how you felt about writing something that's so audacious, and you know, what was your experience with agents who read it, and what they were looking for, and you know, what you weren't giving them that they were expecting?
Yeah, sure. So let's see how to come at this question, which is really interesting and sort of multi-layered. I sort of started out, I mean, one of the things that brought me to fiction in the first place was a desire to be subversive when it came to writing about things related to queerness, related to Palestine and Palestinians, where, as many of us know, especially in the US, it's not so easy to address Palestine head on through nonfiction. So I thought fiction would be a great way to kind of do that. And as Safwan mentioned, it's a form of sort of art is a form of soft power, sly, subtle act of persuasion in some sense. And so once venturing into that, into the genre, you know, with this mission of sort of challenging stereotypes and offering a totally different, much more nuanced perspective than one that was seen, you know, on television and other forms of mass media, I, you know, one of the, I think one of the sort of things that comes with that is a sort of like, maybe just like sanitizing lesbian love stories and sort of exactly as you said, making them more about emotion and sort of like emotional connection and sort of avoiding the kind of sexual, you know, component of them. And so I felt the need to bring that in. I mean, I myself had always craved reading more, you know, sex when it came to say like lesbian stories. And also, I mean, part of the character's plight is, or part of the character's struggle is that she engages in these sort of destructive behavioral patterns when it comes to love. And often that can mean a kind of avoidance of intimacy in the first place, sometimes through just, you know, the physical act of sex without, you know, intimacy and connection. And so that was also part of it. A lot of her reasoning for doing that stems precisely from, you know, shame and internalized homophobia when it comes to actually engaging in a healthy same-sex relationship. And so, you know, as Samar suggested, when it came to, you know, agents and kind of expectations, I came up against a lot of sort of obstacles in that realm because agents, people in the industry kind of wanted to see more of the stereotypical conventional images when it came to representations of Palestinians and Arabs. They wanted more, literally they asked for more camels, more spices from the marketplace, more women in hijabs, more repression and oppression of Arab women. And, you know, since the whole point of writing this novel was to challenge all of that, I had to really resist that, and it kind of lengthened the process of finding the right publishing team for the book. So yeah, that's my answer.
That's amazing. I just love, thank you for sharing that again. I wanted to share it with the wider group. Before we move on to Saleem, I want to read a little excerpt from your novel, if you don't mind. And this is talking about that, you know, sex is an addiction, right? You can't, I mean, this is why the sex scenes are not gratuitous and it's not just for fun. The sex is a body of evidence of a pattern of addiction. You can't talk about sex addiction without having lots of sex scenes in the novel, which I just thought it was just really, really well done. And this also reminds me of Milan Kundera's. It's almost like a nod to The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And it reads, it usually started with the hollows of a particular collarbone, the professors, the nutritionists, the editorial assistants, anyone's other than my actual partners, growing into a full-fledged obsession with whomever they belonged to. In an attempt to escape my thoughts, I'd solicit and seduce others to the point of mental annihilation, only to wake up the next morning with my obsession fortified. Alcohol made it worse. So did drugs. Exercise, especially when combined with a playlist, was nearly lethal. And the factors that elevated the behavior from bad crush to addiction were time and intensity, as well as the compulsive behavior that accompanied it, namely fucking to forget.
Very relatable.
Yeah. Excellent. So Saleem, I will go back to how you break the stereotypes, right? Because I will happily read for you some of those excerpts. But before I do that, I'm just going to give you the space on a blank canvas to how you decided to explore how pathetic it is, in the words of Raza, for a homosexual who's emotional about his own homosexuality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it you know, I didn't write with this idea of necessarily breaking stereotypes. I think, I mean, also I am a
Oh, his internet froze.
Yes, he'll come back. So maybe his electricity cut out and he just needs a few seconds to switch to 4G.
Samar, maybe in the meantime, until Saleem comes back, to Zaina, and something you can address now or later, the parallel with the Palestinian cause, and when one looks at how during the most recent events in the late spring, there's been a tremendous shift in how the world has reacted to the plight of Palestinians. And I argue that it is because of the arts. It is because of fictional work and biographical novels, if you will, that have been written, and film and other forms of art that have put on the world stage a Palestinian sort of human story with history and heritage that are interwoven into it, that made the Palestinian and her cause far more relatable to a Western audience compared to before 20 years ago. It was strictly a political discourse. And before that, it was a violent discourse. So I just want to plant that seed. And now I see that Saleem is back. So I should go back. No, that's okay, Saleem. I was just offering a thought.
Yeah, I want to apologize to everyone watching for the bad internet connection on my end, but I'm trying my best to keep going. I don't know where it broke off exactly.
You were saying that you didn't write the book specifically with the idea of combating stereotypes, and then it cut out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I didn't really write the book with this idea of combating stereotypes. I think I was just trying to write my own truth, and I think that's just the way that those are the questions that I was thinking of in terms of my own emotional attachment to homosexuality and my own emotional attachment to the men that I would have sex with or fell in love with. And so I was the novel was my space to unpack all of those things. I think as much as possible, I mean, I try in my writing not to think too much about whether it leans into or away from stereotypes, because I think that raises very thorny questions about who you're writing for and whose gaze is driving your writing. So I just try as much as possible to explore the complex spaces with no clear answers.
Very good, thank you. Shall we pick up, Safwan, with what you said about, you know, like it is that, you know, when I opened the remarks, my opening remarks, I said that things start to change when the truth starts to come out, right? And so we had a discourse that was political, then we had prior to that, it was a discourse that was, you know, conflict-ridden. So like you said, violent.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But now we have real people, you know, and with real lives. And I think I'll come back to the question of stereotypes, but I will read you something that Saleem wrote. And this is his character. Raza has just immigrated to the US to study. He spends 4 years studying, and something happens. September 11 is not mentioned by name, but we gather that it's the big terror attack. And then he suddenly notices a big shift in the way he's being related to, in the way he's being identified. So he writes, I tiptoed everywhere, lost in my thoughts. This Arabness, this Muslimness, this was all new, a new marker of difference, a thing I had been my whole life, a thing to which I had previously not given a second thought. But this was not just any old thing. No, this was a thing that killed and maimed and destroyed. I was no longer someone with thoughts and dreams and secrets. I was the byproduct of an oppressive culture, an ambassador of a people at war with civilization. I had come to America preparing myself to be like a character on those television shows. I was going to be Blossom's best buddy. I was going to have a coffee shop gang like in Friends. More than that, America was going to offer me the space to examine myself in something clearer than the foggy mirrors in my grandmother's bathroom. At the very least, I had hoped America would give me the space to set free the birds in the cage in my mind, to sit through the memories of taxi drivers. And this is an illicit porn channel called Polskasat. Polskasat images that I had been diligently filing away. But I was instead confronted with something completely new, my Arabness. I want to scrub my skin off, my name off, my accent off, anything to deflect the suspicious looks.
Love that.
Yeah.
So for me, like what it does here is it's almost like a universal experience of being Arab in the West after September 11. That there's this sudden shift. And then when you write those stories, when those stories are now being available, you have this complex character, you know, who's a gay man, who's very political, who's very well read, who's, you know, being emotional about his homosexuality against all stereotypes and expectations. You know, suddenly where does that image, that, you know, low fidelity image of the Arab and the Muslim, it can't go, it just disappears into thin air. So I'm just wondering, Saleem, if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think this is really the power of literature in terms of really allowing us to get inside the consciousness of someone else for an extended period of time, which I think is why I prefer literature to other forms of media. But I also think that often we can ascribe too much political importance to the effect of literature and to the impact of literature. So I think we should always be careful because, and I mean, like we were talking about, you know, I've done a lot of book clubs and I've spoken to lots of different types of readers. And I used to always think that every reader was made the same, but I don't think that after 5 years of touring and talking about the book. And I think it's because there are certain readers who will come into the book with a set of assumptions and not be willing to leave those assumptions at the door when they engage with your work. And so they will only then really pick up and look at the parts that sort of feed into their preconceived notion of what it is that they're about to read. And so I've had people who've really focused too much on like the difficulties that Rasa has faced in terms of, you know, the idea of aib and coming out and his grandmother and his love relationship and those things that will feed into this idea of the homophobic, oppressive, barbaric, Muslim, Arab world, whatever. And as a writer, I can't force them to look that way or look this way. You know, I present them with the murky sort of complex truth, and then they can pick out and choose what they want.
Thank you. There was also, for me, I mean, there was a lot of overlap between Midian and Saleem, between Zaina and Midian. So I'm just kind of trying to maybe not necessarily go into that, unfortunately. The second theme for me that I thought was common across all three works was that feeling of displacement. And for Midian's work and Zaina's work, it was incredible how much commonality they had in terms of the pains of being Palestinian. For Midian, there is this scene in his memoir where, you know, he's just having a regular conversation with somebody on a bus, and somebody else overhears him, and then he gets into an altercation. And in Zaina's novel, she just takes it, she really turns it into something humorous. She makes it something that we can laugh about. There is this one sentence where Zaina says that, you know, if her mother was Hamas, her father is Israel. You know, and she compares the dynamic in their relationship to that, so that we can just feel a little bit light about it. But there's also another scene when her character is in a treatment center for all sorts of addictions, and the character walks into the room, and all of a sudden people are kind of like looking at each other, and you know, they've had a conversation about how she needs to be educated about, you know, actually that she's always complaining about people not being educated about the Middle East. So Zaina, I just wanted maybe just spend a couple of minutes just talking about that experience where wherever we go, there is always this sense of discomfort, this sense of not belonging, and this longing for home, which, you know, we discussed offline as also kind of being a fractal of the character's experience in her interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, so I think the entire book is sort of centered around displacement insofar as the driving force of the book is this question of unattainability, and that sort of was the seed of the book for me. I mean, I'm making it sound super like sort of philosophical, but there's also this burning desire to tell a certain story that does touch on some aspect of one's life, be it even through fiction, right? I mean, I don't know why anyone else would write you have to have that burning sort of connection, I think, to something in the first place to write it. But so in terms of what you're asking, so unattainability exists in this book on three main levels. And the first is, all right, let me just sort of start over. So the character, the seed of the book was a desire to explore this question of why it is that something that's off in the distance can often be more appealing than what's right in front of you. And I first sort of located that question in Unrequited Love, of the character sort of pursuing unattainable women. Then I thought about unattainability on a cultural level of like this being sort of displaced from one's culture, one's, you know, homeland, and sort of wanting to belong fully to her Palestinian heritage. And, you know, for her, the mother sort of represents that, because the mother is the immigrant generation. She's first generation. And then I thought about unattainability, or it sort of occurred to me that all of this sort of stemmed around the unattainability related to being Palestinian, and unattainability of homeland, of statehood, of self-determination, of, you know, all of those existential unattainabilities that exist and that leave Palestinians in a perpetual sort of state of longing. And so, so yeah, displacement in that sense kind of drives everything within the book, and the narrator kind of grasping at ways to attain while still feeling unable to fully do so in any of those realms, all of it underlined by being Palestinian in the diaspora.
Thank you for that, Zaina. Saleem, do you have thoughts on displacement, a sense of not belonging?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, in the novel, alienation and displacement is something that Rasa's constantly grappling with, and I think it happens on a number of levels. I mean, the first is around identity markers, and that's something that I kind of wanted to explore. So at various points, Rasa is alienated from different words to describe his sexual identity, as well as different identity labels like Muslim and Arab. When they were foisted upon him in the US, there were these labels that he didn't necessarily feel at home in. And I think I wanted to mirror that with the political alienation that one feels within, from, you know, the political alienation someone feels from the status quo in the Arab world, especially pre Arab Spring. And I sort of wanted to dance between these two sort of parallels. And I think as well, there's a few other forms of alienation, one of which is alienation from language, especially Arabic, which mirrors my own alienation from the Arabic language growing up, partly because I really struggled to find a space in the Arabic cultural media that I was being offered, where I could really explore questions that I was really asking myself about who I was and what I desired. So I kind of wanted to have this sense of displacement within the family, within the community, within the nation. And how do we find, or how does Rasa find himself, a space for himself inside these places, even if it is somewhere like Guapa, which is this tiny rundown bar and, you know, in the middle of nowhere.
Great. Safwan, we have about 15 minutes left. Should we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation is going great, so just continue with it and we'll integrate questions. We don't have too many questions, so I really urge our audience members to please write questions using the Q&A function. I mean, one is not even a question, but an acknowledgement from Tracy Young, who wants to, you know, so excited about the discussion and mentions how she feels very fortunate to have had Saleem as a guest storyteller at her book club. So there you go, Saleem. But then there's a question that I'm not sure how we can address, but let's put it out there. Does Rabi Alameddin, as an author, provide a lucid view into the westernization of Arab states, in particular Lebanon, from the perspective of a homosexual global citizen who spends time both in the Middle East and in the United States? So again, I mean, does he provide a lucid view into the westernization of the Arab state? I'm not exactly sure what that means. But I would also say that he's not, Alameddin is not unique. You know, he may have been a trailblazer, but I think all three of you fit into that, right? You know, you write about homosexuality and you transverse the Middle East and the West. So, Zaina, I think you're ready to say something. So.
No, I always look like I'm ready to say something.
Okay.
I'm happy to. I don't. That's not necessarily a compliment. Whatever that comment. Sometimes that's a criticism, right?
No. Which comment about being ready to say something?
No, the question. No, the question.
Okay.
The question that it's, you know, that's the whole accusation that we're really helping globalization in a way, by bringing things that are not indigenous to the region, having
maybe
to ourselves. So yeah, sorry.
Well,
no. It's a little unrelated, but it kind of got me thinking about what Saleem was saying earlier about like thinking about this sort of whose gaze one is catering to, and like kind of bearing this, you know, we sort of talked about stereotypes, and like indeed, you know, at like in some, I was certainly myself thinking about sort of not, or sort of how to sort of subversively challenge stereotypes, but at the same time, it's unfair, I think, to hold writers in any, you know, with any background to a sort of burden of representation, or having to bear a sort of burden of representation, you know, because that in itself, I think, is a form of oppression in some sense, and looking to like, you know, individual works as having to kind of like represent everything. Versus just like one narrative of one character or one family or one, you know, relationship. And I just think it's sort of tricky territory, kind of echoing a lot of what you were, or it just got me thinking about that sort of like line of like feeling like you're being held up in some way as some, you know, sort of representative, while also just wanting to tell a story that, you know, is messy and that sort of speaks to whatever your imagination or your truth wants to convey. So yeah, I just thought of that now when we were thinking about this sort of this question about Alameddin.
Yeah, I mean, it's I wonder if the question is also related to this whole concept of the Gay International and Joseph Mas'ad's work that claims that there is an imposition, sort of, and of a Western identity or identification, and that it is, of course, part of a colonial conspiracy plot to impose something on the region, which in my mind deprives people of the region from agency, right? I mean, so you have the power to choose how you identify and whether, there is a lot of organic stuff that is going on in a movement. I would say that Zaina and Saleem, I would venture to say that you came to your own conclusions about your identity and how you want to represent sexual identity in the works that you've done. So, and people oftentimes forget that homosexuality has been part of the social membrane in that part of the world for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that fully, but I think, personally, I've always felt slightly not necessarily at home with the label of gay. I'll use it because that was sort of the identity that we're using to describe the sexual practices that I practice myself. But I feel ambivalent about the usage of the identity. I much prefer queer because I feel like it's a much more permeable and broader sort of identity category, although certainly that has some problematics around sort of erasing, the specificities of different gender and sexual identities. But for me, I feel I'm always a bit, maybe it's the Lebanese in me that's always a bit apprehensive about like putting too many identity categories on people because the more you sort of divide up into sub tribes, then that just rings alarm bells for me.
So I think
we have sorry, Samar.
No, I would love to add something to this conversation, is that it's not about labels, it's about power dynamics. And so I see this in Zaina's and in Saleem's novels. So in Zaina's novel, her character has an affair with a married woman. And at one point, that's how this affair ends. She's like, were you ever in love with your husband? And the woman says, I'm still in love with him. And then the whole relationship just falls apart because the character suddenly realizes that she's basically a plaything for this married woman whose ambassador husband is on, So that's the sex as an act rather than sex as an identity aspect for that woman. Same thing in Saleem's novel. The Raza is in love with Taimur. Taimur is not really, he goes and has a wedding, like a fake wedding and things like that. And so that unwillingness to ascribe to an identity actually gives you power in a society because it allows you to pass. It's like passing when, African-American passing for white, for example, passing for Italian, which is where that concept comes from. So it's interesting because the claim is that adopting an identity gives people power, or it's an imposition, a Western imposition. But in fact, not adopting one is the one that gives you power in a society, in a predominantly homophobic society.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to share that. So
thank you, Samar.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I see we have
a lot of questions now. So
yeah,
great,
so let's just go to the questions.
Okay, so one question to all three of you, and let's try to deal with it quickly because I want to get to some other questions that are interesting as well. This John Doherty is asking about how your books are received within the Middle East, North Africa region. Who are your readers? Are the books banned in some countries, smuggled into others, available and reviewed in others? Saleem?
Yeah, so how are the books received within the region? I think that they from queer readers it's been received well, but it's available in some countries, and it's not like soft banned in others, i.e. they won't stock it in the library or in bookstores, etc. But it is available in some countries. we've been trying for a number of years to try and get it published in Arabic, but sadly, we've had difficulties because a lot of publishers don't see a financial gain in publishing a novel that is likely to be banned in a lot of countries. So it hasn't reached the viewership, the readership beyond sort of English speaking readers, which is a disappointment, but there's nothing that I can do really from my side.
Samar, Zaina, anything to add?
I mean, I guess I'll just say that, yeah, I mean, among queer Arab readers in the Middle East, it's been, I've received a lot of, great feedback, and it's been really wonderful to hear. And then I'm not quite, it hasn't been translated into Arabic, which is, I hope that it will be as well at some point, just to sort of reach obviously more Arab readers. And I don't know how it's been received on a level beyond that. I do know, I haven't been to the Middle East since it came out last summer because of COVID, but I know that before it came out, I did go and spend about a month in Palestine, just because I felt like I had to hug my country before it came out. I was just afraid of what might happen in terms of, my ability to sort of move freely around, having a book in the world that touched on such themes. So that's my answer.
That's great. Samar, let's switch to, I mean, a couple of questions deal with, and Zaina just mentioned Palestine. So the whole issue of pinkwashing, right? And to explain to the audience, it is when it's sort of queerness is weaponized. That's the theory of pinkwashing, that queerness is weaponized by Israel to establish a false binary of the civilized and the barbaric, right? And that's echoed here in the US regarding Palestinians. And the audience member is asking whether you could address how your work may confront this form of propaganda. But there's also a comment from Sarah Khalifa, saying that she has the impression that there's great affinity and protection amongst both gay communities in Palestine, Israel, and whether you see that to be the case. That's not my impression. I think Israeli gay advocacy groups reach out to Al-Qaws in Palestine, but they are rebuffed because, they need to be sort of, that's a form of pinkwashing, the way that they see it. And if you talk to Israeli gay advocates, they say, we get that, we understand that, but, our domain is in gay advocacy, and it's not sort of on the political. Anyway, any comments on that front? Samar, maybe you, and then Zaina.
I think I'll let Zaina go.
Okay.
I mean, what I can say in response to that is that when I was writing the book, I had in my mind this sort of line of, wanting to both sort of combat pinkwashing, right? But also to say that, to show that there are progressive strains within Palestine and within Jordan as well, and within, the perception from the West is so primitive when it comes to LGBTQ communities, queer communities in the Middle East, that there is a lot to sort of highlight in the ways of achievement and in the ways of like progressiveness. At the same time, I can't overstate that because that would be false, right? And so I think, it was such a sort of careful, but it was like this tension between not wanting to portray those strains of progressiveness and highlight them, to challenge these really primitive perceptions that the West has, but also wanting to be true to the reality and to the struggle of so many queer people in the Middle East who, don't know this progressiveness. So that's my response.
I just want to say, on this question of pinkwashing, it's something that I think is one of the big challenges when it comes to telling and writing queer Arab stories in English or for quote unquote Western or English speaking audience, is that how do you find that balance between talking about the very real challenges that exist in our societies while not sort of being co-opted and also speaking out against those who are weaponizing and manipulating the challenges that you face for their own sort of colonial gains? And I mean, that's what Israel is. It's a settler colonial apartheid state. So the idea that, you know, the gay inhabitants in that settler colonial apartheid state would have an alliance with the people they're oppressing without actively rejecting Zionism and the basis of the state that they're in is ludicrous. So, I mean, unless these very tiny minority sort of fringe anti-Zionist Israeli queer organizations are what your friend is referring to the person who asked the question, then I think your friend doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. So there's so many questions. I don't know where to go, and we only have about 3 or 4 minutes left. But here's one that caught my attention from Russell Lord to you, Saleem, who says, please remember that as the younger folks accept the word queer, in the 70s, when I came out, it was used as a very derogatory term. The word queer was a curse word. Maybe our community has embraced it as a show of power. Not sure, but food for thought.
I mean, yeah, I get that completely. And I think if we were having this conversation in Arabic, then I would use the word shad or I would use the word luti. But if I use those words, then Russell Lord wouldn't know what I was talking about. So I'm using the word queer. But I still find queer for me, and maybe that is because it is a sort of reclaiming of the term. And while it has not been used against me personally, I have been called the Arabic version of that many times. So I understand the pain of it, and I also understand the power of reclaiming it.
Yeah, and Russell Lord, by the way, identifies himself as an Israeli Jewish gay guy, and he is thanking all of you for this fascinating discussion and peek into your thoughts. Then maybe before I turn it back to you, Samar, you know, for a closing question. Alice Guthrie is asking about how you think your narratives are consumed by readers in the broader SWANA, Southwest Asian, North African, which encompasses the Middle East, which I think we sort of dealt with in Doherty's question, but I put it out there. And then Natalie Weeks makes a comment. It's really not a question. What you describe is what African-American writers have faced forever. And I wonder if you have any comments about that and about intersectionality in that regard.
Yes, I feel a deep, deep connection and solidarity with African-American writers and African-American activists here in the United States, for sure. And I think, like I said, social change begins to happen when the truth starts to spill out. And justice is basically acknowledgement of that truth. And that truth is invariably, whether it is the struggle of African Americans in this nation for recognition, for equality, for access to the same things, for social justice, for distributive justice, for economic justice, for racial justice, or whether it is the truth of a gender and sexual minority person, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, nameless, whatever you want to call it, the truth of their humanity, their right to exist in the way that they should be free to exist, or whether it is the truth of a Palestinian. When those truths start to spill out, that's when you start to see social change. And naturally, you're always going to have groups that, well, are benefiting from the suppression of that truth, right? So yesterday I was at a talk and I gave the example of tobacco companies suppressing the truth that, well, you know, smoking kills, right? Because tobacco companies benefit from the suppression of that truth. But there's something forensic about the truth. It always has to spill out. You can't really ultimately hide it. And the same thing happened with African-American people in this nation that I'm in. And the truth is that they are human beings and they should never have been enslaved or segregated. And same thing for Palestinians, same thing for LGBT people. So what I believe these novels do, what I believe their strength is, and never underestimate the political power of literature and the arts. On the contrary, I think what people are captivated by are stories and emotionality rather than facts. So I think I'll probably disagree with Saleem on that point. But when literature is not in service of the truth, then it is propaganda. And so, we aspire, I guess, as authors, as scholars, I'm a novelist myself, to be on the side of truth. And yeah, I just want to thank everybody. I think that's a kind of a good point to wrap up right there. And I want to thank people for the questions, for bringing up the question of what African-American writers are facing. Absolutely, 100%.
Thank you to the audience for all the great questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I'm glad we got to a few. We could go on for another hour easily, and I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to each of the three of you. You are all inspiring, and to at least one of the comments that came on. I mean, I grew up in a very different time in the Middle East. Growing up in the 1970s. Of course, none of this ever existed, and one felt incredibly alone in that part of the world, and but knowing that there's a different world out there that was going to be accepting and that was going to be a refuge, if you will. And so I just want to end on a word of appreciation, not only for your participation today, not only for the great works that you have produced, but for your courage and for giving a voice to a substantial and significant part of the society, a community that is oppressed and has a very, very long way to go before it gains acceptance. But I do hope that this arts sort of track will lead, indeed, as it has in other parts of the world, to more progress on the political side of things. But really, I'm just incredibly impressed and very, very, very grateful to you for the work that you do, for who you are, and for your courage, and for your intellect, and for sharing so much of yourselves on today's webinar. So thank you. And thank you so much for your brilliant moderation of this.
Thank you for the incredible novelists.
Thank you. Yeah, Samar, thank you for such wonderful questions. And Safwan, thank you as well for this incredible opportunity. And Saleem, lovely to see you and be in conversation with you as always.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing, if it's possible. This is all making me think about the importance of trying to get, and I think that's what I wanted to do with Guapa, and I think that's what Zaina's doing, and I think that's what a lot of queer artists are doing now, is to just kind of record a sense of what's been going on in the queer Arab sphere in our moment in time. And I think we haven't had that for a really long time, and it's very important to have a record of queer stories throughout history. And I'm really sad that Madian couldn't join, because I think that he really is such a gem of knowledge and history. And I'm really looking forward to reading his memoir. I started it a few nights ago, and I would highly recommend it, because I'm sure that it's going to be a really important book.
It really is.
Absolutely.
I have the privilege of reading the manuscript, and it's really a great book, and deals with many, many of the issues that we've discussed here today. Look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully in person. And with that, thank you.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.